So how do we change the world? I think we change the world by building, I'll call it the ability to have trusted conversations at scale. That's how we change the world, Dave. It has to happen from the bottom up. Can't come from the top down. It's not just what we're talking about. It's not just the type of stories we're telling. It's about telling it to a group that we trust as opposed to speaking out to a crowd through social media.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets?
Welcome back to Inside the Coffeehouse on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. In this podcast series, we're introducing you to Coffeehouse, Smarter Markets' new social media platform for advancing the conversation on energy, climate, markets, and technology. It's a space where the executives and icons you listen to on our podcast can engage with each other in thoughtful conversations, disagree without being disagreeable, and discuss how our market systems can be redesigned and improved to address the most important challenges of our time, including climate change and the energy transition. That feeling of grabbing a cup of coffee with colleagues to catch up on the most important issues is what we're creating on this platform, and our Smarter Markets members are invited to follow the conversation. If you'd like to learn more about Smarter Markets Coffeehouse or join our waitlist, visit Coffeehouse at www.smartermarkets.media. Building new markets begins with the exchange of ideas. Many of today's great exchanges were born in coffeehouses, including the New York and London stock exchanges. At Smarter Markets, we're building our virtual coffeehouse to facilitate the exchange of ideas that will lead to the smarter markets of tomorrow. Our guest today is Ben Hunt, author of Epsilon Theory and co-founder and CIO of Second Foundation Partners. We'll be discussing what AI is teaching us about how we use language and how we can build digital tools not to outsource our consciousness, but to create the ability to have trusted conversations at scale. Hello, Ben. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
It's great to be back, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here. I always enjoy talking with you. And I think part of that is you've always thought deeply about language, its structure, its power in shaping how we think and the choices that we make. And with the mainstreaming of artificial intelligence in the form of large language models, I think we've all become more curious about not only how do these models work, but what do they tell us about our own use of our language? So I wanted to ask you, we talked a little bit over a year ago, but I wanted to ask you, in that time, how has the development of LLMs been shaping your thinking about how we use language?
I'll start with something close to home. How we're actually using it in our work. Been trying to think of the best way to describe this. What we do in our day job is we're trying to find the semantic structures in unstructured data. That's a $10 phrase, semantic structures. The examples I like to give, if I'm talking to somebody from Hollywood, I say, well, an example of semantic structure is the hero's journey, right? It's that old story. It's a story arc. It's a script. It's a narrative archetype. There are thousands of different scripts and movies that use the hero's journey as their base. Different characters, different settings, different words to describe it. But what we mean by semantic structure is that it's one story. It's one coherent story. And the kicker is that, I really believe this, is that we humans are hardwired to respond to that story. That our brains are wired not just for grammatical structures, but I think even more so for semantic structures, for story arcs and archetypes, as I'm describing. Now, in Wall Street, in investing, an example of semantic structure might be, well, we're bullish on the new thing. right? Again, can take 1,000 different forms, not dependent on what the new thing is. It's dependent on telling a story in a certain way that we humans are also hardwired to respond to. We start paying attention to that new thing. We start getting excited about the new thing. So that's what we try to do in our day job. And our initial cracks at this, and I've been working with language. We didn't call it large language models. We didn't call it natural language processing 30 years ago, 35 years ago now. My God, we're getting old. But that's what it was. The math hasn't changed. The linguistic approach hasn't changed. But what has changed is just the raw firepower that's at our fingertips. So our initial work on this was to use my brain and my partner's brain, Rusty Gwynn, to use our brains as the engine here. So what we would do is, this is a famous Richard Feynman phrase. How do you do science? Well, you think really hard about a problem, right? So that's what we would do. We would think really hard about an archetype that we had a glimmer of, and we'd write down libraries of words and phrases, grammatical structures, convoluted rule sets for the linguistic searches and wildcards and lemmas, as they're called. It worked actually pretty well, what we were able to build by thinking really hard about a problem. But it was small, what we were able to build. And what I mean by small is, I like to use a fishing analogy. So you're fishing in a lake that's got all these amazing fish in it. And we built the equivalent of a little hand net, a little dip net. And so when we dip it in, remember, this is a lake full of fish, we'd catch some fish. Think of that as signal. And the signal we would get would usually be, oh, that's a good fish. It's a good signal. We didn't have a lot of false positives. We didn't catch something and say, oh, that's a signal. And it turns out, that's the boot. It's just an old shoe that was in the pond. When we caught something, it was decent sized fish. But when we put it into practice, our actual results were fine, not barnstorming, not great. And the reason was, there were all these fish that got away. Too many false negatives, in other words. We didn't have a big enough net. So what we did in our own work was, let's replace the Ben and Rusty thinking really hard about linguistics and semantics and the like, and let's get a large language model which is built around the conception of semantics. It doesn't think like me and Rusty. It doesn't think like us humans. The artificial intelligence of a large language model, I like to call it a non-human intelligence. Artificial, that makes it seem fake. It's not a fake intelligence. It's a real intelligence. But it's also profoundly not human intelligence. We've all seen, I think, the cartoon of the Shoggoth monster with the million eyes and kind of the jelly monster, that this is what a large language model is, and we put a pleasant face on it through our training and our reinforcement learning and stuff like that. But it's a very non-human kind of monstrous thing back there. We said, okay, let's use that as our engine. Let's build a back end and a front end large language model as, I'm mixing all my metaphors here, but as our steam engine here, as our source of energy. And maybe we'll catch more fish. I bet we catch some old shoes as well. Our expectation was, okay, we'll be catching a lot more fish. We're building a much bigger net. We'll get a lot more signal from incorporating large language models directly into our technology stack. We'll get a lot more signal, but the signal probably won't be as high a quality as the signal we got from Ben and Rusty thinking really hard about a problem. And in fact, when we built our new net, put it into the pond, we caught a lot of fish, a lot more fish, like 10x more fish. The crazy thing, though, Dave, was that we didn't get more false positives. We got a lot less. It wasn't just that the amount of signal increased dramatically, like by a factor, like 10x, but the quality of the signal improved as well.
And that's really fascinating, right? Because sometimes the pejorative approach to LLMs is it's like advanced autocorrect. So you kind of get in this false picture in your mind of, oh, it's thinking a word or two ahead of what's the most likely word to come next. But when you're talking about these semantic structures, it's much deeper, right? Is it recognizing these story arcs or example of the hero's journey? Does it somehow extract that this is the arc that's playing out in this text?
100% that's what's going on, Dave. You read the white papers from the model builders and the like, they talk a lot about semantics, the semantic layer. So it's in the white papers, right? But in our own everyday world of investing or making movies or writing about sports teams or playing a fantasy sports game, right? We don't think in terms of semantics. We tend to think on kind of what's on the surface of our language. And on the surface are specific topics. I'm going to search for XYZ. Tell me what's being said about, in other words, what's the new thing? To use that Wall Street example I was using earlier. Let me do a search on the AI or whatever you think is the new thing. But that's not what this non-human intelligence of a large language model, that's not how it thinks. It thinks in semantics. It thinks in story. You're right, it's predicting the next word. What predicts the next word? Well, it's the underlying structure of human communication. And the underlying structure of human communication is not sentiment. It's not using mean words or nice words. It's not topic. It's semantics. Human beings, we speak of the world in terms of story and story arc. We perceive the world in terms of story and story arc. It's just the water in which we swim. So we don't notice it, right? We don't read it and think, oh, well, here's the semantic structure. It's like the substrate or the fundamental dimension of language. And it's the native language of large language models, which is why when we incorporated it into our work, it was like, oh my God. I'll give you another metaphor. What I'm convinced, and this is not original to me, but that when technology is invented, once you get the initial invention, every technology follows a path of increased resolution. Another way to describe, oh, we're catching more fish and they're better fish, is we're increasing the resolution of the information system that we're looking at. There are tons of fun examples of increased resolution. The camera on the back of your smartphone, the number of pixels goes up and up and up. Moore's Law is another example of increased resolution. Video games and the number of polygons that get rendered, increased resolution. I think that this is such a helpful way to think about any new technology, to think of it in terms of increased resolution, and that this is a very inevitable feature of all technologies, the increase in resolution. So the kicker is, when we're thinking about where is this all going, what does it mean for what we all do for our day jobs, what would an increase in resolution mean for the technologies that matter to you? And start planning for that increase in resolution. For us, it's thinking about an increase in resolution for understanding linguistic structures. For someone else, it might be increased resolution in communication networks. I don't know. I'm making stuff up. I think that is such an important point to think about. What would an increase in resolution mean for the technologies that are important for you, and plan for that?
And thinking about these semantic structures, these linguistic structures that seem to be kind of the native thinking of this non-human intelligence, are you finding that not only is it kind of extracting these structures out of the data, is it finding ones that you might not have noticed yourself when you were thinking hard about it? Is there a way to deploy it to say, oh, here's the hero's journey that Joseph Campbell extracted by looking at lots of different myths and thinking hard about it? Is the AI starting to say, you guys are telling all these stories, you're telling thousands of stories. Do you realize you're telling the same story?
It's harder to back that out with our current front end and back ends for large language models. But this is a really good example of what I mean by think about where increased resolution would manifest itself and plan for that. Quick example of what you're talking about. I've always been fascinated by these old stories and the narrative archetypes that we tell ourselves over and over and over again. And one of the sources of those stories are, I'll call them fairy tales, myths, fairy tales, folk tales. So I bought a big, thick book recently that collected Indo-European folk tales. These go back thousands of years. The story of Rumpelstiltskin, that story is way older than Christianity, right? That story goes back to like 3,500 before the Common Era. And the stories have been organized by date, for sure, but also thematically. And I started reading this because I said, oh, yeah, let me poke around some of these old folk tales. And I'm pretty well read on folk tales and the like. And I was reading these, I'd never heard that story before, or I had heard a different variation of this theme. And there were a couple of themes that got repeated there. They often came out of some of the Central European and Slavic regions, right? Stories often around brides and bridegrooms and death and princes and princesses and underworld and all like that. And stories that I was not familiar with. But once I started reading like 3 or 4 falling in one of these thematic areas, it kind of clicked to me that, oh, you know what? There's a motif in a lot of sci-fi horror movies I've seen that have this in it. I don't think it was intentional on the part of the authors. I think it's just we are hardwired to tell these stories and we get a receptive audience. Or when an author stumbles on one of these old stories and starts to craft it and mold it for a modern age, I think they get a good response to it. Even if they weren't aware of, oh, well, in 1000 BC, the Indo-European tribes in Proto-Russia were talking about this stuff or having these stories. I think these structures are there. I think we don't even realize it. I think they come out in the stories that we invent because when they're successful, we're tapping into one of these old stories. So, long-winded answer to your question. I think that the way to use the current front end and back end we've got for large language models right now is prompt it with these different thematic structures, let it read a couple of the old stories, and find new examples of it today. There are thousands of these different thematic structures, most of which are stories that I've never heard of or read, but stories which a large language model can recognize immediately. The payoff here is that our ability, a human's ability to write new stories that tap into the old stories through a large language model that's aware of the different thematic structures and can kind of help and prod to follow along one of the old stories' archetypes. It's just wild, right? I really think it could just not revolutionize screenwriting and writing of plays and novels and the like, but I think it can augment it enormously by giving any author the ability now to tap into the old stories in a way that we just couldn't before.
When you think about the success George Lucas had tapping in with Star Wars into that old hero's journey arc and motif, a lot of other things in there, but that was a really essential connection.
A lot of other things in there, right? And this is what I mean by increased resolution. There are hundreds of different story archetypes that you would find in the Iliad and the Odyssey or the Aeneid. Increased resolution means being able to tease out those individual sub-archetypes and sub-stories that you find in these great old stories, the epics, and then being able to take that as like the seed stock to write a new story today. The ability to create compelling fiction by using the seed stock of the old stories with our modern settings and modern insights It gets me so excited about what's possible. And next we need to talk about what makes me really depressed. But the ability for large language models to help us tease out the old stories that we're hardwired to respond to and create new stories to entertain and educate and amaze us. It's all there. It's just waiting for us to tap into it.
I want to ask you about tapping into it. I don't know if this will take you to where you're excited or where you're depressed, but obviously the stories we tell ourselves really shape our thinking about the world, our decision making. Politicians, marketers want to tap into those stories. As you said, the capability to tap into those types of archetypes and stories are being augmented as these artificial intelligence, non-human intelligence can recognize them and respond with them. And you've also spent a lot of time tracking kind of the stories that we're telling ourselves and that we're being told about what's the new thing or how that's influencing us. So I'm kind of curious, when you go out fishing, so to speak, what stories do you find that we're telling ourselves now?
Let me start by telling the stories that we don't tell ourselves a lot of very often today. And I think that these are the stories that there's an opportunity to tell them again, and that there's a hunger for the stories that we don't tell. We don't tell stories of love and empathy. We don't tell those stories much anymore. We tell an enormous number of stories around bargaining and instrumentality and contracts. We tell an enormous number of stories around that. We tell an enormous number of stories around the pot of gold and wish fulfillment. Enormous number of stories around that. They're all good stories. These are all good stories. But it is really noticeable to me that our stories of empathy, our stories of love, you don't see them outside of the narrow genre that says, oh, this is going to be a story of romantic love. And that's a very narrow genre. Sorry, it wasn't always this way. So the institution of the church, and this doesn't have to be the Christian church, this can be any of the old religions, the institutions, the social religions that built up around them, they all had their contracts and money and the like, but there was a stitching of community, a stitching together of community that religious institutions played, other community institutions played, that just been wiped out. They've just been wiped out in favor of the stories we have around sports, politics, and money. It's resulted in, I like to call it, a speculation protocol or a speculation layer. I like to call it a protocol because it's, I think a lot of this audience is familiar with network systems, computers, and you talk about, what's the protocol layer, talk about the different layers of a stack of a network. Well, we've inserted this in linguistically speaking. I'm going to call it the speculation layer, speculation protocol, that now is just on everything. Everything. It started in markets, as you can imagine. That's where something like start. But now it's spread into sports. It's spread into politics. Sports, politics, markets being three of our four primary social interactions, right? The fourth being religion. And what you've seen there is just a diminution of religion in general, so that politics, markets, and sports become a religion. But the stories that were associated with religion, and religion, I think, is oddly not impervious to the speculation layer, but it's highly resistant to the speculation layer. The speculation stories and its impact on sports, politics, and markets is just running rampant around our world.
And what do you think the implications of that are? Because, when I think about the spheres you've discussed of politics, sports, and markets, right? It's very much centered kind of around either an individual or a team, an us versus them, a me against the world. When you think about what does that lead you to do, it leads you to be good at bargaining or good at confronting, but there's kind of a missing gear, right? Like, I feel like when you look at a lot of religions, what they always emphasized was, no, you're actually connected to each other in a way that you don't understand. You're not by yourself. I heard once that original meaning of sin was to separate. I don't know if that's true or not, but it always kind of had an appeal.
No, Dave, you hit the nail on the head. What the speculation layer allows, the speculation linguistic layer, and its pervasiveness and its perversion of markets, sports, politics, these ways that we humans interact, is exactly as you described. Alienates us in the original sense of the word, means it separates us. And it allows our society to become clinically sociopathic. Clinically sociopathic, meaning I'm really not making a value judgment on sociopathy here. I'm describing what sociopathy is. It is the absence of empathy. It is the absence of connection, of a social connection. It is a series of masks that one puts on to play at being sociable or empathetic, if that's the behavior that is instrumentally advantageous. What it creates is just that. It creates a clinically sociopathic society, one that is dominated by high functioning sociopaths. That's who runs our world today, are high functioning sociopaths. And again, I use that in the clinical sense of the word. I think we all see that and feel that loss of community, that loss of submerging of our identity, our human identity, within an identity that is put upon us, a team, right? Whether that's sports, politics, or markets. And what we lose is both our empathy, our community. I think, Dave, we lose ourselves. I think we lose ourselves as well.
And how do we get that empathy layer back in? Because I think if we've learned anything from the social media algorithms, it kind of pushes things to extremes. And so if, now you have AI added to the mix that will kind of recognize and promulgate, kind of what it's seeing. So if we're not telling the empathetic stories, if we're leaving that layer out, then that's not going to feed into the algorithms of the LLMs, and the stories they tell will have less and less of that and more of the sports, politics, markets piece that doesn't focus on it. How do we restore some of that balance, especially in a world where the algorithms are, correct me if I'm wrong, but it would seem they're going to be designed to push you to a corner?
I don't think we get out of this easily at all. And I absolutely don't think we get out of it from any sort of top down action. The reason I say that is that our corporate and state institutions, I'll call it organs of social media, are probably the biggest part of the problem. Not because of what is communicated on them necessarily, not because, we don't have stories of empathy, we only have the stories of sociopathy that are on these social networks, but because the nature of a social network is no longer one-to-one communication. The nature of a social network is one-to-many communication. We speak differently. The way we speak, and I'd argue the way we think, is changing not only in the type of stories we tell, but in I'll call it the meta of telling stories. We speak differently when it's a conversation like you and I are having. We know other people are listening. When we're speaking to each other, we understand that we're actually speaking to many. And we all do this now. Whenever we tweet something, we know that we are speaking to a larger crowd. It absolutely changes for the worse the way we speak. It changes it for the worse, right? Because he said, the line of Nietzsche, if you stare too long into the abyss stares back into you. We're not just speaking to a crowd, we're allowing the voice of the many to come inside here and be confused with our own internal voice. This is my partner Rusty Gwynn's phrase, and it's a good one. We are outsourcing our consciousness to the many, to the crowd, through the venue of social media. So when you ask, how do we get out of this? It's really hard because we have to move away from the social media venue, the speaking to a crowd venue, before we can even start to change the type of stories we tell to be ones of empathy, love, community, rather than of instrumentality and sociopathy. So we've got to solve two problems here. That's why it makes it really tough. It's not just a matter of, I'm going to tell, good, wholesome stories and that's going to work. It ain't going to work. It ain't going to work, A, because those stories get crowded out by the success in the world as it is of the sociopathic stories. And B, it doesn't work because the stories I'm talking about, they need to be one-on-one or part of a small group. They're not meant to be spoken to a crowd, because when you speak to a crowd, you speak through symbols, you speak through memes. There's a structure to speaking to a crowd that is very different than the semantic structure of speaking in a small group where you trust the other people. So how do we change the world? And this is why I was so excited you invited me to come back on your show, Dave. I think we change the world by building, I'll call it the ability to have trusted conversations at scale. That's how we change the world, Dave. It has to happen from the bottom up. Can't come from the top down. It's not just what we're talking about. It's not just the type of stories we're telling. It's about telling it to a group that we trust, as opposed to speaking out to a crowd through social media.
I love the way you put that, the trusted conversations at scale. It's what we're trying to do with our own coffeehouse platform. And you're making me think about so many things, right? Like if I talk to you, I know that other people are listening, but I can also see how you react to what I'm saying, right? And being a person who has some empathy, I will adjust how I'm talking based on how I see you reacting. And it'll give me clues as to, is he understanding what I'm saying? Am I understanding what he's saying? Should I repeat that back so I make sure we're both on the same page? And you obviously can't do that when you're broadcasting. And I think anybody who's done public speaking, one of the tips you're given in the beginning is like, try to find a friendly face in the crowd and talk to them. Because then it's a human conversation and it feels like you're talking to the room. But I think often what we find is human psychology being what it is, we end up feeling like we're talking to the most hostile face in the crowd, as opposed to the friendliest sometimes when we're doing this simultaneous broadcasting.
Isn't that the truth? I feel that way. I mean, people often tell me, but you're so nice when when you're on a podcast or something. Why are you so angrier when you're on Twitter? And it's because I'm bristling when I go on there, because I'm expecting that anything I say is going to get bam, 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 bam. Cry harder, Ben. It's really happened to me a couple of times. I leave my DMs open for anybody, and I'll get a DM, and somebody say, I really didn't mean to be. Came at me kind of hard there, and I really didn't mean it. Sometimes it's disingenuous that, I didn't mean that, but sometimes it's not, and I feel terrible because I'm prepared. I'm having a different sort of conversation. I've girded my loins and I've got my armor on when I go on to social media. And I know there's something that I lose when I do that, when I have my armor on. So it's having the ability to have conversations where we can take the armor off and we can trust the other person not to use our words against us. I don't just mean, instrumentally like in business, although that too. I mean, that's part of the trust as well that we're talking about. But even more so, they won't use your words against you in, hey, get a load of what this guy said.
Especially in a world where everything we say is recorded and stored forever, right? So your worst moment can be replayed over and over.
Oh my God. Isn't that crazy, Dave?
I'm glad I went to high school and college before that happened.
Good Lord, me too, right? I mean, high school, college, I feel like I would have lost so much to feel like everything you do is being watched and recorded forever.
I love there was someone who had a disclaimer before they gave a talk, and it was something like, I don't necessarily believe everything I say. And I think you need that level of trust, right? Where it's like sometimes you're thinking through something, it's new to you, you're trying to articulate your present frame of mind, but you're not 100% committed to it. And can you have that honest conversation and work through it with another mind?
Well, it's really hard today, Dave. So it's working through and having that conversation with other mind, but it's also, the conversations we have with ourselves. Because we do have everything recorded and there's this necessity placed on consistency so that you're not shown up. I find that it impacts the conversations I have with myself, that I'm much less open to changing my mind about things. Or I have to make more of an effort to say, no, maybe you were wrong. Imagine that. It was much easier to be wrong when anything you say can and will be used against you, right? Where we didn't live in a world where we're basically being read our Miranda rights when we wake up in the morning. Anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of social media. I hated reading him in grad school, Foucault, because, he writes in a language that's intentionally obtuse and difficult to understand. But the concept, again, not original to him, but to Jeremy Bentham, the notion of the panopticon, the most effective prison in the world is not the one with the most guards. It's the one where you think someone's always watching you. If you think that what you're doing is always being recorded and could be used against you, man, that constrains your behavior so much more than anything else that can happen. I really feel like we build our own mental panopticons in our prisons. No, I can't change my mind on this political candidate or this sports person or this celebrity. No, I'm on team this or team that because we've outsourced our consciousness, right? And so it's so difficult to reclaim that for ourselves, that autonomy for ourselves. I think the only way we can do it is to find those small groups of friends, and have conversations where we work things out and talk about stuff without worrying that it's going to be stuck in your ribs.
Such a novel invention, the friend. And I wanted to ask you, like, for doing this, we've been building our own coffee house and thinking about how the format of our digital communication alters the content, alters how people engage with it. I think the original character limit on tweets was a great example. Like, remember when that first came out, it seemed like, what are you going to say in so few characters? But it completely changes the way people communicated with each other. I'm curious, like, how do you think about, do we need to change some of these formats? Because I don't know what the analogy to form follows function is in language, but is kind of the content of our communication, the content of our thinking being shaped and constrained by the formats we're able to communicate in.
Do you read books anymore, Dave?
Seldom, unfortunately.
Me too.
It's gotten much shorter form.
Me too. I want to be a book reader. I used to be a book reader. And we can be honest here, I don't read books anymore. I buy a lot of books because I want to be a book reader. The book has become really a totem to me. It's less of a source of information, entertainment. Honestly, books have become just like a totem, an object that make me feel better to have around me, but that I don't use instrumentally the way I used to. I can force myself, I guess, maybe to become a book reader again. I don't think that's a winning formula. I think that we have to recognize how we have been changed by the pervasive sociopathy of the system, by the technology that is both this enormous and incredible energy source, as we started off this conversation, and is an energy source that can be used against us. I think what we have to do, Dave, is not try to force ourselves into the old ways. My God, we're all going to become book readers again, and we're going to like it. I think I think I just got to admit to myself that I like having books because they make me feel good to have around, but I ain't going to read them. Not the way I used to. I think that by using what we've got, which is this enormous form of energy and invention in the form of large language models and that non-human intelligence, really to create extensions of ourselves, not to outsource our consciousness, but to leverage our consciousness, man, that gets me kind of excited. And I know that that's a big part. I think that's a big part of what you guys are working here, that it's a place to have trusted circles of conversation. And it's, I'll say, native to digital agents and using large language models to extend our consciousness, not to outsource it. I think I got that right.
It's a great way to put it. Absolutely. And, I just wanted to close off, and I could talk with you for hours. To me, it's very interesting as I think back through this conversation, right? On the one hand, we're moving into an age where computers are finally speaking our language. At the same time, I think it's making us really confront our own limitations as humans. Making me think of things like Dunbar numbers, right? Like most human groups are of like 5, and the most people you can have a meaningful relationship is maybe 150. And we're just wired for a certain scale of interaction, kind of based on family units and villages and millions of years of evolution. And so, at a time when we're able to operate at such scale, but our minds really aren't able to comprehend it, how do we need to shape and take control of our digital communications and interactions to make them fit our human capacities and human scale? And do we really need to take a hard look at that and say, look, we're human beings. This is kind of the scale we can operate on effectively?
Quick answers for me are decentralized, decentralized, decentralized. That what doesn't work is top-down imposition of a structure that says, thou shalt communicate in this scaled way. That changes the way we think, changes the way we communicate, and not for the better. It outsources our consciousness. If we stay focused on this notion of, nope, I want to have my own autonomy of mind, that's job number one, my own autonomy of mind. Yes, I have limitations here in terms of how many friends I can have and close conversations I can have. All right, stipulated. And I want to have an ability to expand my consciousness through digital agents, however you want to describe it. They stay under my control, or if they're not under my control, I don't have to trust them as much. So I've got a decentralized way of trusting the agents that I use to expand my consciousness and my communications with other intelligences. You've got a way to trust yours. We've got a way to trust each other in a decentralized way. That's the way we go, I think, Dave. It really is. It doesn't come from above. It comes from below. It comes not from some big bang of, oh, I'm talking to 1 million people now. That ain't it. And it doesn't come from, oh, now I've got 10,000 friends, because you don't. I've got different circles of trust and friendship, and they're meaningful to me. The semantics work. Decentralize that, which we absolutely can, using generative AI as our friend, and I would say tool, but as our friend, as our ally. I honestly think we can do it. Decentralized, focus on our autonomy of mind, circles of trust, never from the top down, preserving the semantics, the meaning of trust so that we can choose who we have conversations with and who we don't.
Thanks again to Ben Hunt, author of Epsilon Theory and co-founder and CIO of Second Foundation Partners. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of Inside the Coffeehouse. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets? Contact us at onboarding@abax.exchange. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.